today. For those of you who are joining outside of the Rural Action for Climate Resilience project, welcome. Just a brief background, the Rural Action for Climate Resilience project is a partnership project between the Southern African Faith Communities Environment Institute and the Social Change Assistance Trust. And we work in different parts of rural South Africa with community-based organizations, legal advice officers, faith leaders, and we've been working with the same or similar groups of organizations for the past, 3 years. The focus of the project is building rural action for climate resilience. That's the title of the project. And today, because we understand the interconnections between economic justice and climate justice, today we're focusing in particular on budget advocacy. And we are very lucky to have Thokozile Madonko from the Southern Center for Inequality Studies at Wits University, who is a researcher managing the Public Economy Project, and also an activist and poet and climate campaigner in her own space. I won't take up too much more time, but I would request that for the course of the webinar, you keep your cameras off and you also keep yourself muted. This is to be respectful to the speaker and also to make sure that we don't use too much data. And also that we don't distract the speaker by talking while they are talking. So we'll have the presentation first, and then we'll have time for discussions. So without taking up more time, I'm going to hand over to Thoko. Thank you so much for joining us. Stop sharing. Oh, sorry, that.
Okay, good morning, everybody. It's so lovely to be with you. And as Tara said, I'm Thokozile Madonko, and I'm going to give you a very brief introduction to budget analysis. So a little bit about what is budget analysis. I'll go through it. I'm based at the Southern Center for Inequality Studies. Please feel free to reach out. I'll make this presentation available to Tara and the team so that you can have it on hand, but it also has my email address, so you're more than welcome to reach out to me if you have any questions. So yeah, just a little bit about me. I was born in Zambia, and I grew up in Zimbabwe, and then I got educated in South Africa and fell in love in South Africa and have a beautiful daughter. And I do facilitation, I do boxing, I love reading, and I do climate work as well, climate action work, and poetry. So that's what I bring to the table today. And I've had years of experience in the budget advocacy sector as well. So today's presentation, we're going to talk about, is this a budget issue? So often we need to be able to articulate what it is that we're focusing on, be it access to water, be it access to services. You know, how do we make sense of the environment in which we're working in, and whether or not this is a budget issue becomes a question. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about what is budget advocacy. So what is that about? And then the purpose of fiscal policy. So budgets, what are budgets? They're policy, they are law. So it's important to remember when you see the budget tabled in February, that is actually a money bill that then gets voted into law and gets passed and signed by the president, like all other laws do. So remember, it is policy. Then a little bit about why I want to encourage you to take on economics, and why we should be talking about economic issues, regardless of which sector we come from. And then I'm going to give you a very brief overview of the national and provincial macro organization of the state from a fiscal perspective, so from the budget process perspective, and the 4 stages of the budget. So that's kind of what we'll do today. And this is really a part 1, because normally when we do budget advocacy work, we do 12-day trainings on how to do budget advocacy. They are very in-depth, intense. So this is really a beginner's, a really touch point, and we can go much deeper if people are interested, and that we can collectively think about how can we use the online space to deepen our expertise and understanding of budget issues. So, as I mentioned, not all public service issues are integrally related to fiscal policy. So, before you jump to the budget itself, you need to ask a few questions about, is government responsible for the delivery of the service? Is it responsible for regulating this service? At what point does government step in, and at what point would there need to be resources going through the state in order to make sure that that particular issue that you're interested in can be dealt with? Does the budget allocate sufficient funds to address the problem? So these are some of the questions you can ask about. So is this a corruption issue? Is that then a budget issue? So often we hear, oh no, there's enough money, corruption is the problem. So it's not a budget issue, it's a corruption issue. And some would argue, well, actually, corruption is a symptom of a budget issue. So you're often having to work within the space. But what you're essentially always thinking about is, does government have a role in delivering or overseeing or ensuring? So when we talk about environmental health, for example, that is a regulatory, there are regulatory issues around making sure that livestock are appropriately treated for disease and so forth. And then you want to see if that isn't happening, if we're seeing outbreaks of disease amongst livestock, as we've seen with climate change and the increase in diseases amongst livestock, there might be an issue with the resourcing of the regulatory aspect of government services to make sure that environmental health is being maintained, for example. So the other question you can ask is that, is the budget being distributed among programs and services appropriately? So one program might be getting a lot of resources and another program not getting enough. And so your issue might be that, look, if you look at social development, it looks like it's getting a lot of money because of the grants, but you're actually interested in mental health issues and mental health services, and climate change and mental health services is a huge issue now. Are there enough resources being allocated, and are there enough services? Can people access mental health services? And then lastly, are the funds allocated to address the issue actually reaching the intended beneficiaries? So I saw somebody is from the early childhood development sector. So there you have a question around the subsidies that are coming through education to early childhood. Are they reaching the children? Are those subsidies enough, first of all, and are they actually getting to the children, or are these ECD sectors, under so much pressure that of the 10 Rand or whatever allocated per child, and I'm just throwing, I know it's not 10 Rand, but just using that as an example, maybe only 3 Rand is actually reaching the child in terms of services and beneficiaries. So, and we've seen work on the social relief of distress grant that even though the grant is available, it's not reaching the intended beneficiaries because it's so prohibitively difficult to access those services. So what do I mean when an issue is not a budget issue then? Well, I'm of the belief that everything is a budget issue at the end of the day, because we want government to play a role in being able to ensure that they're providing either services or playing an oversight role in the delivery of private services. So I'm a little bit of but certain things require attitude change. And so a lot of you are working in the climate space. We know that a lot of work has to be done about just getting people to understand that climate change is an issue. So that isn't necessarily a budget issue per se, but you would then ask what government programs, awareness programs are taking place to enable people to access the necessary information they need to understand climate change. And that then becomes a budget question for you. So here around, we kind of try and elaborate this in this diagram from a fantastic piece of work on the right to food, is that you are wanting to change mindsets. So certain aspects of gender-based violence, for example, is around patriarchy, is around men's attitudes around women. That's a mindset. It's very hard to say this is a budget problem, right? But we can say there's not enough awareness raising, and so there should be, greater programs to deal with masculinity issues or whatever it might be. But then there can be direct interventions where there is a strong relationship to the government budget. And so we see when it comes to access to basic services at local government, the system is set up in such a way that you should be able to access a minimum set of access to water and electricity at a basic level that you should not have to pay for, because that has been funded. That is a direct intervention. Another one, of course, is receiving the child support grant or the SRD grant or the old age pension. If there's a direct intervention, if people are not accessing it, you can see there's a direct relationship. So in this example, if we are concerned about the right to food, there's a lot of work and attitudinal issues that we need to do around access to healthy foods, access to understanding how climate is affecting farming, how we want to protect seed sovereignty, whatever it might be. And you can then have a specific idea of how the government needs to modify its budget and or policy or program to enhance that enjoyment of that right. So if you're interested, for example, in seed sovereignty, you're going to look at the policies around protecting the sovereignty of seeds and making sure that we don't have GMO or unnecessary patenting of indigenous seed knowledge, for example, that can have an impact on the long run to the access to the right to food, which is around, small-scale farmers being able to harvest their own seeds and not have to be dealing with big agri, for example. So what is budget research and analysis? So what am I trying to introduce you to? So it's really the analysis of fiscal policy, which is just another way of saying budgets. And it can be a question about how government raises money, and that depends, in terms of taxes and levies, how they borrow money, for example, as well. Are they borrowing it from domestically? Are they borrowing it internationally? In what ways are they investing in the economy? How are they spending? Most of us spend most of our time in the spending aspect and the public resource management. So that's where we're talking about corruption, we're talking about the Auditor General's work, we're interested in whether people are receiving services, the quality of those services. And so that's really part of what budget research and analysis is. So you take your issue. So if your issue is concerns about the quality of the school buildings in your community, you are then going to engage with the Department of Education. You're going to look at the budget for education. How is it being raised? How is it being distributed? Well, how are they managing those resources? So you really want to look at analyzing the revenue sources and budget allocations, and you want to see how they will impact on poverty or on other specific developmental or social justice challenges. So I'm speaking very broadly. If you were a group of health activists, I would then be talking specifically about health. If you were a group of access to water, then we would talk about. So I'm using a very broad, so if it feels a little bit broad, I want you to have in the back of your mind, and you can put it in the chat, what are the issues that you're interested in? So are you concerned about clean water? Are you concerned about access to energy? Are you concerned about the quality of early childhood services? So what is it that you are identifying? Unemployment amongst young people. What have you identified as an issue or concern? Street lighting, police services, whatever it might be. Put that in the chat, and then that gives us a sense of what you are focusing on. So we also analyze the plans and the budget allocations and expenditures to see whether to what extent they advance or undermine economic and social cultural rights. So we try and ground our work in the right to health, the right to education, the right to dignity, the right to equity. So we try and see, are these allocations exacerbating inequality, undermining rights, or are they actually strengthening? So, we know that further investment in dirty coal, big coal-fired powered stations is not investing in a healthy environment and the right to the healthy environment. Investing in green, sustainable and socially just renewable energy projects that could be community-based, that could then be actually dealing with issues around energy poverty, also dealing with environmental justice, for example. So we also analyze the plan's expenditures to shed light on a specific sector. I've mentioned that. So whatever you're interested in, people with disabilities, elderly, poor, rich, women, farmers, you can pick and see, okay, what is government saying and what is it spending on this particular sector? Very importantly for all of us, we also analyze the budget process. So that is how it actually works. How do we get from the plan to the actual budget to the execution? And I'm going to go into that in more detail. But the public participation and quality of participation, the right to know, the right to be able to access your municipality's budget is absolutely critical. Issues of accountability and oversight. So is somebody watching the way in which your municipality is spending money? Who is asking questions about the quality of spend, and so forth, and holding people accountable. So that's also a very important part of budget analysis that you could focus on. I'm in the process of doing a whole analysis on the fiscal ecosystem. So every institution that's involved in the budget process, because we want to know how it works in practice and what does it mean for public participation. And then the other area of my work, which is very important, is monitoring the implementation of the revenue and expenditure sides of the budget. So we want to actually see that schools are receiving resources. We can actually go and do social audits where we go and have a look and see in informal settlements where they have these public-private partnerships with the provision of toilets. Are those toilets being serviced? Are those contracts available? Are they, and are people actually receiving the necessary sanitation services that these contracts are supposed to be providing with the use of public funds? So you can pick and choose, and sometimes you're doing 1 or 2 or 3, or you try and do a little bit of analysis and then you hit a snag and you realize there's no information and there's no data. So you get into the budget process, public participation and access to information issues, the right to know issues. And so what I'm hoping by the end of today is that you are going to go away and be a bit more interested in asking some of the expenditure and revenue questions around the issues that you are focusing on. Sorry, my thing is just frozen. So what can I tell you about the impact of this work if you get involved? And this is from research that's been done over the years. And the exciting thing about budget research and analysis is that it empowers ordinary people to participate in the budget process by demystifying the budget. So, and it can be a very small part of the budget that you're interested in, and you unpack it and make sure you understand, what does it look like for your clinic, your local clinic, and its access to resources, for example. And then you empower people to be able to understand how the clinic is run, what the resources are available to that clinic, how many nurses should be there. That's all budget work and budget advocacy and research. It informs public debate. So we have big questions about the just transition. You know, how can we shift and change the way in which we raise money and spend money in order to deal with climate change? So this becomes very important, and we can begin to provide objective analysis, as objective as possible from a rights-based perspective, of budget and policy proposals. So when we see the REAP policy being tabled, we can interrogate it, and we can also see what kind of resources are going there. Or at your municipal level, you look at your IDP and you can say, look, this is not, makes no sense given the need in our communities. This IDP should actually be focusing on X, Y, and Z. And so you can engage and inform in public debate. It also brings about policy changes. So, for example, greater allocations for programs to fight poverty by using data to demonstrate the effectiveness and financial viability of those efforts. So a big win has always been, an example that I use is the child support grant. That was one, the extension to 18 was one on the back of research and analysis and budget advocacy that then extended the child support grant to 18. And so it brought about a policy change, which was that now, children were seen throughout their life cycle, for example. It can help improve delivery of public services. So my favorite example of this is the work that's being done by the International Budget Partnership, I can't pronounce it right now, sorry. Isivilelani, I don't think I'm saying it right, I'm sorry. But basically looking at access to water and sanitation issues, and they've been able to improve the delivery of sanitation services in some communities where there have been these public-private partnerships. It can also promote more transparent, participatory, and accountable budget processes. So if you are interested in your local government budget process, just being there, asking questions when they're debating the budget, that creates a more transparent and participatory. You're holding your public officials accountable for the decisions they're making about the allocation of resources. And it also enhances your advocacy efforts. So if you're interested in street lighting in your neighborhood for safety and GB reasons, once you've done the analysis of where the streets should be, what the IDP says, etc., you then have more evidence to say, listen, there is enough funds, for example, for streetlights in this neighborhood. Why are there no streetlights? And here is the evidence from the IDP, from the SDP, the DIP, the budget documents, and so forth. But also we should focus on government budgets because we have a constitutional obligation. And it's about social justice. And the South African history, it's also about healing the divisions of the past and recognizing that we have fundamental human rights. And also to lay the foundations for a democratic and open society. So by debating and questioning, because essentially the budget is rhetoric and policy stripped down to its bones. If you want to know what government really thinks and is really doing, you look at the numbers. That tells you what's going on. And also, we're interested in improving the quality of life of all citizens, and we want to build a democratic South Africa. And a government budget is a cornerstone to that. It provides the literal rands and cents to build a more democratic space. And in the Constitution, it's also about Section 195, and people often forget this, about holding public and private power accountable. So it's about, the Constitution is very clear and says people's needs must be responded to, and that the public must be encouraged to participate in policymaking. So when you're asking your public officials to show you the budget, you're not asking them because you think it's a good idea. You're not asking them because you hope that they'll be nice to you or they'll do you a favor. No, the Constitution is very clear. People's needs must be responded to, and the public must be encouraged to participate in policymaking. So it is your right to accountability. And so it is absolutely critical that we engage in these spaces and know our rights as set out in Section 195 in terms of when we are saying we want to see the efficient, economic, and effective use of resources to deliver services for early childhood development, for example. So here's an example of budget work on the right to food. I wanted to give you a little bit of an example. So here you have the right to food. You're interested in the right to food, and in the context of climate change, this is becoming more and more critical. So you focus on the issues of concern and assess whether it raises right to food questions and whether it is connected to the government's budget. Remember, we always have in the back of our minds, is this a budget issue? And then once you go, actually, this seems like a budget issue, and you know there isn't enough being done around promoting small-scale farmers, for example, or protecting small-scale fishers. So there's this big case happening around these big fishing vessels that are creating problems for penguins and for communities, fisher communities, right? So you then look and see what aspects of the government's budget, so who's responsible, where does that policy lie, which parts of the budget process are particularly relevant. In this case, you want to see small-scale farmers, are they receiving subsidies, or is there a set of packages available to them? And then it's to check and undertaking the appropriate analysis, so understanding the question at hand. And then you might go back to one to say, yes, this is a right to food issue. And then you come back to presenting a claim. So this is taking the results of your analysis and articulating what they say about government's compliance with the right to food. So you can say, you know, we've looked at the budget in the Eastern Cape for small-scale farmers, and there's hardly any money going towards small-scale farmers. This undermines our right to food obligations. And, you know, we would argue that X amount needs to be allocated to small-scale farmers, or the X amount that has been allocated to small-scale farmers is not reaching small-scale farmers, because sometimes it's about the funds not reaching the beneficiaries. Remember, that can also be a finding, depending on what you're looking at. So the purpose of the budget as defined by the South African budget process is really straightforward. It's the government's money, is the people's money. So don't let anybody tell you that we're not all taxpayers. If you went to your local spaza shop, or you bought some airtime, or you purchased a Coke, whatever it is, you probably paid VAT, value-added tax. And so you are a taxpayer. So the government's money is the people's money. So when you hear them talking about a narrow tax base, it's absolute nonsense. Everybody pays tax in this country. The budget is always a political exercise. So it is about politics. And it starts with choices about how we believe and think that our society should look. And it ends with political choices about which programs and projects get funded. So you're engaging in politics when you're engaging in budget work. So what is the national budget? I'm going to start big, national, and then I'm going to work my way down to local. So according to Parliament, the budget is an annual plan for what government wants to achieve and how it will spend money to achieve those goals. It is the most important economic instrument of the government, and it's used to make sure that the state has the resources it needs to do its work, create conditions which stimulate economic growth, clearly indicate the priorities of government. And this must be read in tandem with the Constitution of South Africa. So that's if you want to understand what the national budget is, it sets the framework for everything else, provincial and local. So the budget is, as I mentioned, is a law. It's the money bills, and it's governed by the Constitution and the money bills legislation. So it's a piece of legislation, like all legislation, And so it requires public participation and give effect to the Constitution. So it should advance the realization of socioeconomic rights and establish, I mentioned this, democratic values based on social justice, and ensure that people are able to engage. So you need to be involved, and this slide also holds for provincial and local government. So if you are more interested in your province and how your province is delivering, you need to get involved in the provincial budget process. If you're interested in local government, you need to get involved in the local government budget process. And like all laws, there has to be public participation, there has to be engagement. So from national right down to local. Parliament, and here I'm talking about Parliament, I'm talking about provincial legislatures, and then it's slightly different at local government, but they have a similar lens in which they switch over. So it's slightly nuanced at local government, but for Parliament and legislatures, this is essentially the view of the budget process. So the political process, so they're seeing that there's only so many resources available. And so how are those resources being allocated? The administrative process, so the planning, coordinating, control, evaluation. The human rights process, so are the funds being allocated in compliance with the state's obligations towards the full realization of constitutional rights? And they also see the different functions of the budget as allocation of resources, as I've mentioned. Very important for the South African case, and this is what we need to remember, the distribution of income and wealth. We live in one of the most unequal countries in the world, and so we have to ask about questions around distribution in this country and how it is that resources get distributed between wealthy and not so well-resourced neighborhoods and communities. And that becomes an important question. It's also about stabilizing the economy, so making sure that we are ensuring that our economy is run in a particular way that can enable resources to be raised and distributed. And then the budget principles is transparency, participation, accountability, equity, and equality. So that's when Parliament and your legislatures are looking at the budget. These are the kinds of questions they have or supposed to have in the back of their mind. But what have we really seen in the last little while about government's view of this policy, right? So they, as I mentioned, that the budget is stripped, and we've seen that from GEAR, growth and economic adjustment, and ASGISA and the National Development Plan, we've seen that the purpose of the budget has been about continued fiscal discipline, which means austerity, and that the budget should prioritize those investments that raise economic growth and improve people's capabilities. But what does that mean? What does that entail? And what we're seeing is that they say their priority is to balance development and fiscal sustainability, which means we are going to manage the budget in such a way that we can pay our debt. And so in order to do that, we're going to have to balance our demands for development and the provision of resources and services. And so there has been this extreme tussle in terms of priorities. And so over time, as you can see, a resilient South Africa making hard choices in difficult times, a new trajectory for national development. So this is the rhetoric around the budget. And what does that mean in practice? So the most important thing that you have to remember before I move on to the budget process is that the national budget is not like a single household. Don't let anybody tell you that, okay? And it's not like a credit card either. You can't max out a government budget. That's not it's not true. So first of all, the government has the ability to directly control money supply. What do I mean by that? It means in terms of how they raise taxes, how they print money. So you, as your household, can't decide, I've run out of money, I'm going to print money. I mean, you can try, but it's illegal. Okay, the only people that are allowed to print money is the Reserve Bank. So it's not for lack of trying. I mean, lots of people try and print their own money, but something that governments can do. Second, government spending is a significant portion of the economy. So it isn't that you have government here and the economy here. It's actually, they're integrated. They're not separate. What government does affects what happens in the economy. So it's absolutely critical that we understand that total spending, meaning the impact of government spending on employment, wages, procurement of goods and services across the economy is massive, okay? And this spending in turn impacts government tax revenue. So it plays this role. It's a player. It's spending and buying and supporting small, medium enterprises. It's doing these big contracts, you know, so it's supporting. And you as a household can only maybe do one or two side hustles. You cannot fully impact in the way that a state can do, can engage. It can decide to open more mines. You can't say, I'm going to open a diamond mine, okay? You can't do that. You can't make that decision, right? You can try, but it's not going to work. Whereas a government can go, we are going to support the opening up of this industry, or we're going to support manufacturing, and you know, so there's more that they can do to actually stimulate the economy. And government spending and borrowing directly affect growth and hence the ability to generate income for itself in the future. So you spending on groceries is very different to a government spending on small farmers, right? It has a huge impact that you spending on groceries cannot have. So it's not like a household budget. It's absolutely important that you recognize that when you hear them tell you they've run out of money, please quote me. A government cannot run out of money. It just means they've run out of ideas and they need better ideas and better policies, because they are a huge, huge player in navigating how the system works. But I think personally that budget policy should be about creating more possibilities. It should be about care, belonging, and respect. And it should be about ecological and social well-being. So I would much prefer that we have fiscal policy that reflects the sacred balance that we want to achieve amongst ourselves and with nature, you know, with our environment, and develop deep democracy, and to really think about a care economy in which women's work is appreciated and valued, in which men's work is appreciated and valued in the way that they are able to then support their families and households, for example. So we want to really move from this extractive neo-colonialist mentality, which is all about domination, subordination, violence. And so we, you know, budget making and budget policy can actually we can talk about an interconnected living economy. So I want to encourage you that economics is for everyone, and the economy is simultaneously mystifying. So how goods and services work. Oh, if I run out of time. See, I told you I can talk forever. Okay, I'll be very quick. It's very, very...
No, I'm going to give you, I think this is really important. So I'm going to give you more time, but I'm going to give you till 12.
Okay, all right.
If that's it, or like another 10 minutes. Yeah.
So in terms of economics is for everyone, the budget talk, it's simultaneously mystifying. So, you know, when we say, what is the economy? What am I talking about? You know, is it performing? You know, are there industries? Is there growth? You hear all these terms. Everyone participates in it. If you purchase something, you are participating in the economy. Everyone knows something about it. So you know that bread went up, or the taxi fares have gone up, or, you know, the electricity prices are, you know, you bought electricity yesterday and last month it cost X and now this month. So everybody understands it. We're engaging with it and understand it. And this is long before any economist appears on the television. So you have a role and a right to engage in economic issues. That's what I wanted to encourage you to do. But we do have to understand the lingo and language. And I have a much longer talk where I go through all this kind of terms and stuff that we need to understand in terms of gross domestic product, growth rates, inflation, all of these things that are often thrown around, and we need to understand them. And so if people are interested in wanting to speak economies, then we can have a session on that as well. But very, very quickly, the way in which we get to the budget in South Africa is through the various pieces of legislation. So the Constitution, the Intergovernmental Fiscal Relations Act, the Financial Fiscal Commissions Act, the Public Finance Management Act, and the Municipal Public Financial Act, which is local government, and then the Money Bills Amendment Procedure Related Matters Act, which governs the ability of Parliament only to amend the budget. So it is governed by a set of laws and regulations and founded in the Constitution. So it's about raising income and spending income, and then implementing and providing existing services or new services and monitoring them. We have 3 spheres of government: national, local, and provincial. And the national and the money is distributed through a series of formulas that look at the provinces and then the division of revenue between national, provincial, and local. And then within that, there's a formula that divides it between health, education, social development, or at local level, it's the local government equitable share. So what that is, it's a series of, you can look it up, they make it very transparent, you can look at the equations and the maths. It's very sophisticated. They base it on Stats SA, so Stats SA is very, very important. And so the national government, in terms of the budget, is responsible for making policy and setting priorities through legislation. The provinces, as we know, are responsible for the bulk of delivery. And they are responsible for education, health, social development, so forth, as set out in the Constitution. And then we have the local government share, which is municipalities, which deliver water, sanitation, refuse removal. Again, the Constitution outlines exactly what their responsibilities are. So how it works is that national government, through taxes and levies, appropriates the funds. So they say, this is how much we're going to raise, this is how much we're going to borrow. That then gets divided through the Division of Revenue Act, national, provincial, and municipal. And then through the Division of Revenue Act, provincial governments then get their money. So appropriations gives money to national, then the Division of Revenue gives provincial and municipal, and then they then divide that money up to provide services. So national departments are, for example, police, defense, higher education, and social grants. Provincial, basic education, health, they are responsible for the delivery of those services. And some services are what are called concurrent services, so are national and provincial, and that sits with health and education. There's a few, and housing, where they are multiple spheres. And then municipalities are for basic services. So this is all set out in the Constitution. For those of you that are interested in local government, we have to see it as having its threefold mandate, which is representation, social delivery and development, and inclusive government. So again, as set out, it should be representative. You should be able to access your ward councillors. There should be delivery of services, that there should be participation, and so forth. And inclusive. So you should be able to engage meaningfully in the budget process at local government level as well. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to go through this very quickly. So in the local government context, you have the political institutional environment, which is the policies, the government priorities, both national and local. We have then, National Development Plan sets out the 2030. Then there's all sorts of different smaller plans, and then you have the IDPs, the SDPs, all of those things that set out the allocation of resources. Then there's the legal framework. So the difference with local government compared to province is that they can raise funds. So they can raise revenue, which provincial government and national government cannot do easily. They don't have that mandate. And then the budget process is where the money comes from, grants, rates, how is the money allocated, what decisions are made, and where's the expenditure. So budgeting for service deliveries tends to work within 3 core budget principles. That is good to remember: living within our means, so fiscal discipline. So the idea is that we can't just use all the resources. We've got to be responsible, got to be sustainable, especially for those of us that are thinking about environmental issues. We don't want them to just go, okay, now we're going to just ramp up, gold production and just dig for gold everywhere and ruin the environment. So there's got to be some living within our means. It's about moving resources to where they are needed. So we want to make sure that early childhood development is a core policy priority, that young children are accessing early childhood services, for example. But we also want to know that we're getting bang for our buck, so that the money is being well spent. And that we are getting value for the money. So, often you'll hear the Auditor General telling all sorts of stories about how much money is spent on, purchasing a car, for example. That's not value for money. There are essentially, at a very basic level, 4 stages of the budget process, and these are recognized internationally. And in these stages, it's who decides. They are decision makers. What is decided, the issues being decided, how the decisions are made, the process. Remember, I said that's quite an important aspect of our work. And how are they enforced, implemented, and evaluated? So the monitoring. We always start with policy. So if you're interested in the access to water, you need to make sure that you understand what the overall policy framework is around water in the country. What does the NDP say about it? You can even go internationally, so what's SADC, or regionally, or, you go as big as you want. And then you go down to what are the provincial plans for the delivery of water, bulk infrastructure. And then you'll go down to your local level, the SDPs, the IDPs, the municipal SD, to find out exactly what they're saying about the delivery of water. So you can't look at the budget without understanding what the policy is. They have to go hand in hand. It's absolutely important. So in terms of climate change, I just threw that up, but I'm not going to go through it. But there's we are interested in climate issues from the perspective of our particular issues, because climate intersects. It's an intersectional issue. It cross-cuts a lot of what we're working on. And so there is a framework that we should be aware of the South African climate change policy context. Okay, there are some fundamentals to remember about public finance. Budgets are rigid. They take time to be formed. They have a habit of being they kind of stay in place. And part of what makes them rigid is salaries. These are commitments. So they can't just decide next year they're not going to pay the teachers. What they have tried to do is say, we're not going to pay you an increase, right? So they have tried to shift that and come up against huge resistance, obviously. Contracts, so if there's a big build or they're fixing up a local sports field, they can't just halfway through say, oh, sorry, we can't allocate that, because that might have been a contract for 3 years. There's also pensions and social security payments, UIF, all of these things are commitments that they have to make sure that they pay for. and debt repayment. So we could default and then the rand would tank and we would be suffering. So we have decided as a country that we will pay our debt. And so that becomes a rigid payment. It has to, there are some areas of flexibility, but it's pretty much, it contains us. So these factors limit the amount of money. So when we are asking for more services, we have to be able to say where the money is going to come from. And that is why it's so critical as activists that we come together and we say, what do we think about the taxation policy, the raising the revenue? They're telling us the pie is this big, but could it be bigger? And if it could be bigger, then we could find the money. If it's about allocating things a bit more effectively, it could be about, so it's, it can be different things. But if we're asking for new services or increase in services, you have to be able to say where the money is going to come from. It's often based on political trade-offs. What you get is what you don't get. So the trade-off, again, as I've said, so where should you look for this money? What would need to happen in order to raise more money for your particular issue? And what would be the political costs from the change in the budget you want? So there's been a lot of debate about the increase in higher education within NSFAS having a huge impact on basic education. Now, one could argue, but maybe there's a bigger question there about raising more taxes. Could we be raising more taxes so that we can actually provide both for higher education and basic education? Why do they have to be pitted against each other? And so there's the formulation phase of the budget, the approval where it gets approved, and this happens at national, provincial, and local. There's a point where it gets executed, so the monies get dispersed, and then the allocations are made, the laws are formed, and then there's oversight, which is checking that the monies, the accounts are being spent appropriately. And here the Auditor General plays a critical role in oversight functions. Okay. I think I'm going to skip this. And just, I've mentioned the AG. So what I wanted to do was a quick quiz. So if we're talking about, there's the formulation where the budget gets formulated and the policies are put together. There's the approval of the budget where there's the debate and discussion and the budget gets enacted into law. Execution where the revenue is raised and the money is spent, and then the budget oversight. There's a few questions you can ask about your issue. Where does it sit in the budget process? So if you're interested in the total amount of money being allocated to eradicate the bucket system, where would you look? Would you be in the formulation or implementation or oversight? The total money, amount of money being allocated on poverty, the introduction of a new form of tax, money allocated to EPWP in the education budget, the non-delivery of contraceptives, fraud in the procurement process, poor financial management. So all of these, if these were your issues, you would be looking at different stages of the budget. That's what I want to encourage you to think about, is that, so if you're interested in a new form of taxation, then you are interested in the formulation phase. If you're interested in the non-implementation of the audit findings, that is the oversight phase, for example. The non-delivery of contraception, implementation phase. So each phase has a different component to it, by way of example. So I've come to the end. I did try to time it and I timed it badly, so I apologize. I hope you're all breathing and I've given you enough food for thought. So I thought if you have a pen and paper or just want to close your eyes for 1 minute, What is your top insight from today? What is the most straightforward thing you could do as a result of this workshop? And what are you taking away from this session? So what worked well, what worked less well, other comments. So just a little bit of feedback so that we can open up the conversation. So if you want to just take a moment to think about what is your top insight from today? What is the most straightforward thing I will do as a result of what this little workshop has, you know, from what I've spoken about, what is the kind of first thing that you think of that you could do? And then what are you taking away from this session? And then we can open it up for conversation. So I'll just leave that up for a little bit, for like a minute or two.
Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you today?
Good
Good, thank
morning, Bovio.
I think the first step will be to access the budget, and also the IDP at a local government level. Because if you want to challenge any issue, you need to refer to the plan of the municipality, that is the IDP, so that you can see the gaps. Yeah. And I've seen also a good example here in the Eastern Cape, in the Nelson Mandela, where the budget and the IDP was utilized by Interchurch Local Development Agency, assisted by Jonathan Walton.
Mm.
And I think that is, but another thing that as I was listening, you highlighted that the process of budget is a legislated process, but I think you also referred to as a law, and I was very much interested in that. And I think we need I think we need more sessions around the issue of budgeting so that we can be able to challenge government. I think the past 30 years, I think we're not pushing enough, utilizing the budget and also the IDP at the local sphere of the state. Yeah, I thank you.
Thanks so much. And Vuyo, can I quickly ask you what area are you interested in? What would you be engaging?
The core to me is the issue of high levels of poverty, but also we have been trying to pursue and understand what is happening with the basic income grant, specifically to benefit, the people between 18 to 59 years. Mm-hmm. We understand that the issue of basic income grant or universal basic income grant will be a reality. Mm. But we don't know how much will the citizens receive from that. Mm. And we've seen this year that government promised to increase the 350, and it was just an increase of 20 rand, which was just nothing. Mm. And I don't think that we must also be in that state or that situation as we are moving forward. I think we must be able to be equipped so that we can engage. We know the facts, the figures, in terms of the national budget. Yeah.
Mm. Great. Thanks, Vuyo. I think I'll stop sharing and then we can have people just come in. Or you can put your hand up or however you want to go. If anyone wants to go next.
There are also some issues that people were interested in when you asked, like, what would topical areas be that people would be interested in focusing on? Some shared in the chat. So it could also be an entry point just to open the conversation if you want to have a look there. I think like farming and unemployment, environmental justice, the universal basic grant, access to energy, gender-based violence, women in farming.
Yeah, this is great. So can I ask, has anybody had any experience engaging with budgets for your particular issue? Have you read a budget? You can put it in the chat or answer. Nampanisa?
Yeah. Hi. I have a problem of network. I didn't catch up all the presentation. I was in and out fighting to be part of the, but I don't know, maybe I'll be next to the road when you are saying the problem on engaging a budget. In my side, I'm from Port St. John's Legal Advice Center. In my side, like when we tried to discuss our budget with the municipality when they are doing their IDPs, ne? So we're trying to discuss those budget. You will find that it's not easy to take part fully, because you don't know the income that they have. Clearly is not put it in the table that on this area we have so much budget, so we budgeted like this. And what I've been noticed in these sessions, when they present their budget this year, and you will find out some of the items presented in 2023 is still on their budget with the same amount or a little bit higher, while there's nothing happened. For instance, we have a program of special SPU, special program unit in our municipality, where our programs as NPOs are under in the municipality. We have our budget there. We plan for the event or for the year, but when it comes to implement, there's no budget within the municipality. We end up as NGOs doing our programs without them. We only invite the special program unit officer to come and just support the program, not to come with the budget that we were agreed on when we were drafting IDP. So that's my challenge in terms of budgeting, because we participate in this budget, but when it comes to implement, there is my big problem in how to, because now even if they will come this year, they will not report to us or present to us that the budget for last year we take to another item, you see. So now we have to rebudget, okay, to start afresh, or we add on the last year's budget. So that's my challenge. It's not easy to discuss or to elaborate more in this budget, especially in our local municipalities. Thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, that's a very important point that you're raising, because one of the things that we are seeing with municipalities is that they're developing budgets that are essentially unfunded. They don't have the money to fund the activities that they're doing because they are not raising the money. So at local government level, it's interesting because what they do is they kind of forecast what they think they're going to raise, and they don't actually raise that amount of money. And so it creates problems for understanding exactly what the financial situation is of the municipality. And so we see that a lot of the local municipalities and rural municipalities are essentially bankrupt. And so what you're facing is also a systemic problem. And part of that, interestingly enough, is work being done around the assumption that municipalities can raise funds from utilities, from electricity and water. They're meant to be, in theory, they're supposed to be able to receive the local government equitable share formula, which gives them a certain amount for free basic services. But that amount for free basic services is not being spent on free basic services because the municipality doesn't have enough money to actually fund its own operations. And so they draw from those funds, and then they don't raise the money because the communities in which they are based cannot afford those utilities. So there's been a discussion about looking at the budget framework for local government, especially in light of climate change. So the utilities question, this idea of being dependent on utilities for resources has to shift because of drought, because of, load shedding is not a climate issue, but there's load shedding. But there is the broader question of people opting out and putting up their own solar if they're rich enough to do that. That means that they then leave behind, proportions. So those of you that are interested in environmental justice, the local government space and budgeting space is very dynamic for this because there are huge assumptions about where resources are meant to come from. Remember that question of raising revenue is in of itself a political question. Where are they raising these revenues and how are they raising these revenues? And is your municipality actually able to provide the services it's constitutionally required to provide? Does it have enough money? And some of the research that we've been doing is showing that they don't. They don't have enough money. They don't have the resources to be able to deliver the services they're meant to be delivering. So you're raising an absolutely critical question. The other thing that you're raising is around the accessibility of the information. And so one of the things that we've tried to fight for, and we should continue trying to look at, is the accessibility of the budget documentation, because it is very difficult to read a municipal budget. It is not easy, even for me. I find it very, very difficult. They have, all sorts of jargon and language, when all you want to know is how much money do you have and how much are you planning to spend and what are you wanting to spend it on? Like, just give me that. And so we talk about, in the budget advocacy space, we talk about people's budgets. And so this is something that you could think about, is saying, we want a people's budget for our municipality. And that is basically saying you want the municipality to provide a very basic, accessible version of the budget. Now, we have that at national. So they do it at national. I think some of the provinces do it. I know Western Cape does it. I think Gauteng as well, where it's just like a little summary. It's like a one-page summary, and it's very straightforward and simple, and you can see where the money's going and how much is being raised, how much is being spent. And so that's also a very important issue, because remember, I was saying part of our work is to engage in these processes, but you can't do it if you don't have access to the information, or you can't make sense of the information that's being provided. So you've raised some really good questions. Pobeza, did you want to go next?
Maybe before that, ne?
Yeah.
Hello?
Yes.
Yes, maybe before you left me, there is this thing of equitable share that is coming from government. How it works, that budget, where does it go?
Yeah.
How can I understand the area of raising revenue? For instance, from my municipality, is not such money or revenue because it's very, very small and poor. So in terms of raising revenue, it's not easy that you can rely on. But there is this equitable share from government is coming to the municipality, and those MIG monies. So it's too difficult, really, for me.
So I think one of the things we can do is we can actually do a deep dive into local government financing, if people are interested, because the local government equitable share, I can go into detail about it and to explain how it works. But at a very simple level, what is happening is that in terms of the Constitution, the municipalities get what is called an unconditional grant. It's constitutional, which means that they can spend that money on whatever they want to spend it on in terms of the priorities set out in the IDP, SDP, whatever, so they can't, they do, but they shouldn't be going off and buying a brand new Mercedes-Benz car, right? But we know that happens. But that's the crude version of crazy municipal spending. So there are some, there are some ways in which these funds are governed. But it does mean that Treasury can't say to a municipality, you have to spend that money on basic services. And that is the gap. So at the moment, remember, one of the things I said that budget analysts do is track whether the resources are getting to the beneficiaries. And there's enough evidence to show that basic service fund, that free basic service component of the equitable share is not being received by beneficiaries. It's going into the day-to-day, and it's not necessarily that the municipality is doing something nefarious. It's just they don't have enough money for operating. They need to pay their staff. So they draw on those funds. So that's in a very simple, and there's huge. SALGA is doing a lot of work on the South African Local Government Association is doing a lot of work on this. But we can go into, we can deep dive into local government financing, because it is slightly different to national and province because of this own revenue raising component that local government has that national and provincial. So when we look at health or education, it's pretty straightforward, because we know that the money comes from national, it gets through the, whether it's a conditional or unconditional grant, and then goes to the provinces, and then, we can track it. It's much harder at local government, but can be done. Not that it can't be done, but it does take time to explain it and what's happening. Yeah.
Meza and maybe Nonsikilelo both unmuted, so I don't know. Meza, if you have a question, maybe you can come in, but you'll have to unmute yourself. Otherwise, Nonsikilelo, if you have a question, maybe you can come in as you are unmuted right now. Or perhaps that was an error. Umeza, did you have a question?
No? Maybe not. So I think this might have been quite an overwhelming presentation, because it's a lot to digest, and I'm so pleased that you've stuck through it. And I'm really excited by the different levels of interest and sectors that you're interested in. And I think that, is quite a challenge, because you want to find a way of providing input that is useful, but also helps you understand your issue. And so one of the things that might be a useful next step, again, it depends on whether you find it useful or not, is to actually spend some time working on the questions that you have in your sector that can be dealt with in the budget. So, if you're interested in unemployment, farming, and municipal service delivery, we can really go, okay, what about that are you wanting to to focus on? Are you wanting there to be employment opportunities within farming, or employment opportunities with service delivery? Oh, I see a hand up. And then, so what we can do is that, and there's a lovely mechanism called the Super Duper Guide, where I can take you through how to develop your budget questions. So first of all, your policy question, your budget question, and then how do you go about answering that budget question? Center for Early Childhood, please go ahead.
Good afternoon. My name is Yusra Ehrenreich, and I'm the Advocacy Manager at the Center for Early Childhood Development. I just wanted to say that this has been incredibly helpful, so thank you so much. And earlier you made reference to just an example, for instance, of the ECD subsidy. And when we were trying to increase that amount, which has stayed 17 Rand for the past 17 years, and speaking to significant people in government at a national level or provincial level, something that they continuously raised, despite knowing sort of the economic benefits, why it's important, why you need to have this political trade-off, they said that they found what was actually lacking was advocacy around budget. And that was a suggestion, because we asked, what more can we do? If you have the information and the data and the evidence, how can you then translate that into acting and increasing the budget, sort of putting your money where your mouth is? And advice was around budget advocacy. So that has been so fantastic. And I was wondering, is there a moment in the budget process where it's useful to connect with or engage with the different treasuries at the different spheres of government? And sort of when would that be? When does Treasury get involved? I understand the parliaments would have to get involved if it's a piece of legislation. But yeah, when do you think of approaching the Treasury?
So thank you. That's a fantastic question. And the nice thing is that as budget advocates, we actually work throughout the cycle. So we are wanting to engage in as many opportunities as possible. And you can have what we call the formal spaces for engagement. So like the medium-term budget policy statement, for example, will be tabled in October now. And so you can do some advocacy work around what you would like to see in the medium-term budget policy. It's a 3-year budget proposal. And you can do advocacy around what we want to see in that. We want this to prioritize early childhood. This is the benefits for the economy, because there's a lot of focus on the fiscal framework, so the big picture. And then there are parliamentary processes involved with that. And then you can also what we call invented spaces. So you can create spaces where you have a closed meeting with a series of Treasury officials, and you can have a discussion with them. There's been some interesting talk now because of the sort of the political change that we've experienced, is that you could do quite a bit of work on now caucusing with the different political parties. So you could be doing that as well, to start getting like just pamphlets out saying, this is why it's important to engage on early childhood issues ahead of the medium-term budget policy statement. And then in February, it's always good. I mean, that's a very exciting time. It's when the budget is tabled. There's lots of space for engagement. And Treasury, the important thing about October and February is that Treasury has to respond. So if you actually present your research and work before, and it's the same at provincial level as well, Treasury has to respond. They have to respond to your input. And so that also then gets that conversation going, which is quite important. So we encourage a lot of, and I mean, you can also join there's the Budget Justice Coalition, which is a coalition of organizations that engage in the budget process, and they do budget advocacy work, and they support organizations to, they are sector, they support, if you bring your sector then gets represented by the Budget Justice Coalition. and then they do the presentations or help with presentations and press releases and interviews and that kind of thing. So that's also a good platform to engage with.
Thank you so much. That's really fantastic. And I'm pretty sure we will reach out to you to get more in-depth sort of workshops as you've offered, because this has been so wonderful. I have a follow-on question, if you don't mind, or if there's maybe no one else with their hands up. Okay. So you mentioned the medium-term budget policy, and we had presented on that or made comments on that related to early childhood development in 2020. And it's interesting that you're saying something around like Treasury needing to respond. So my first question is in what way? Because I don't recall getting a response. And then the second question is, the second point on that is maybe around what you said in the stages of the budget process. So kind of like monitoring and seeing how your comments then turn into laws or change the laws. Because what we're finding a lot of the time when working with government, we also work with the City of Cape Town quite extensively on their policies and stuff like that, is this idea of what is proper public participation? Is it a tick box exercise, or are you considering the comments and reasonably rejecting or accepting them to actually change processes or the budget or whatever the case may be?
Yeah. So so the MTBPS responses come out in February first of all, they respond. Usually the Finance Committee will have Treasury come back and respond to the presentations. So they respond in person. And then in February, the budget review that is published with the budget. So it's the narrative to the budget documents. So it's the narrative to the budget laws. That then includes the responses to the civil society presentations. So it's in that document. So if you have a look back, you should be able to see, if you present it before Parliament, your comments, there should be a response to your presentation.
Fantastic.
When did you say 2020?
Yes.
So you would look at the 2021 budget review.
Okay, that's very useful to know. Thank you.
Yeah. So I just saw a comment in the chat, which I think is also something that we have to think of collectively. That's becoming an increasing issue, is around the actual funding of NGOs itself. And we saw that in Gauteng, there was huge issues with cuts to NGOs, NPOs as well. And so there is a strong move to try and defend funding for NGOs and NPOs. And so absolutely, I hear you when you say that, it's really difficult when you yourselves are constrained and you don't get the funds that you need to be able to exercise your democratic responsibilities, essentially. So again, I would encourage joining the organizations that are fighting or supporting them, that are fighting for better resourcing. This is an area of work that I'm now focusing on, which is financing of the care economy. So it is something that I have on my agenda around resourcing for NGOs and NPOs. And I think there hasn't been enough noise made about what it means to underfund civil society, because that's essentially what's happening. They're underfunding civil society. And so that is the strain that you are experiencing. Yeah, so I don't know, I think we've run out of time. If there's anybody with a burning issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think it might be worth just mentioning that this is the first. I think I might have mentioned it at the start, but some people joined it later, that this is the first of a series of 2. And so we'll also be hopefully putting together a review that you can respond to, and then tailor the second one to be a bit more targeted. Monica, do you have a question?
Yeah. Thank you, Tara. I just want to know, how much is the unconditional grant as compared to the conditional grant in percentage? Is it bigger or is it smaller, the unconditional grant? And number two, I just want the presentation to focus more on the local government, as we are dealing with local government mostly, and have more information on local government issues so that we can engage with the local government properly informed. Thank you.
Perfect. So in terms of the equitable share, the unconditional, it's basically the transfer to so it's I don't have the figure off the top of my head. I think it's something like 70% is the amount that goes, but don't quote me, it's around there, it's hovering around there. That's the unconditional grant. The conditional grants to local government are much smaller amounts. They're not really, you can't even really put them down as a percentage of, well, maybe you could, but they're not, you know, for local government, they really are interested in their own revenue raising abilities than the conditional grants. But that's something we can definitely go into again in more detail, because it'll depend on whether we're talking about a city, you know, municipality, local municipality. You know, it also depends on what level we're discussing and within local government itself. Yeah. Cool.
Any last minute questions before we wrap up? We like to, for those of you who are, this is your first RACR webinar that you're attending, we like to take a picture at the end. So I might just ask everyone to turn on their video so that we can take a picture of all of us together. But yeah, if anyone has a last minute question that they want to throw out before we do that, feel free to do so while